friends, welcome back. I'm Christina, the manager at the Pacific Beach Library. Thank you for joining me for another day of our read-along together of the Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Today we are on day 52 of our read-along together. And so we've got just a little under 2 weeks to go to complete our book. It's super exciting. Thank you for everyone, too, who's already nominated a title for our next read-along together. There is a thread available in our read-along group where you can nominate titles for our next book that we'll share. I do ask that it be something in the public domain, so publish, I believe it's 1924 is the cutoff date. Hi, Ellen. So yeah, publish a little older so that way we don't have to worry about copyright issues. And I didn't write it down, but preferably under 1,000 pages. Let's see what we can do. Let's go ahead and start out with a special tea today. I had mentioned last week in honor of our hitting the 50-day mark, I wanted to have like a golden kind of tea. And you can see that this is actually looking really yellow. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the plunger back up. Let's see if I can do it so you guys can see. And I think you can see like the orange color. It's hard to do from up here. It's still kind of yellowy, but kind of a little bit of a golden to it also. So this tea that we're having today is, technically it's a fruit infusion. It's the orange mango. I'm almost done with my package from Point Loma Teas. I may have to get some more because it's so good. But yeah, this one is made up of orange slices, mango cubes, pineapple, safflower, marigold blossoms, and strawberries. And it is, in addition to being delicious, I just think it's such a beautiful tea. The color is just stunning. So that's what I'm having today to celebrate it being our 52nd day of our read aloud together, because I forgot to do it on the 50th. But still. Oh, and it smells so good. Really nice. Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit about, hi Ellen, let's talk a little bit about the chapters that we read on yesterday's reading, and then we'll go ahead and get into today's reading. So, yesterday we read chapters 95 and 96. Chapter 95 was entitled Father and Daughter, and as I think I mentioned the other day too, I like how that it paralleled what Dumas had done earlier in the book where he had two father and son chapters. And in fact, when I first saw the title, I was like, oh, we're going to learn more about the Villefort family with Monsieur de Villefort and Valentine. But no, they switched it all up. Now we're getting the Danglars family. And so in Father and Daughter, it begins with Eugenie Danglars rather formally asking to speak with her father. Sorry, I'm noticing so much bright light on me. Oh well, it is what it is. Formally requesting to speak with her father. And what she basically tells him is, look, I understand you keep trying to marry me off. But it's like, I didn't really want to marry Albert de Morcerf, so I let you kind of, you know, try to pursue something with Andrea Cavalcanti, but I'll be honest, I don't really want to marry him either. And I'm intelligent, I'm beautiful, and I'm rich. And there's just really no reason I need to actually marry this man. So I think we're going to have to call off this engagement. That's basically what she lays out to her father, who comes back to her and says, you know, you are intelligent, you are beautiful, not as rich as you might think you are. So he lets her know that he has had some bad investments and that he actually needs the money that Andrea Cavalcanti would bring to their union in order to keep the family fortunes alive. And so even though she is not thrilled, she agrees that she will sign the marriage contracts with Andrea Cavalcanti, which will, you know, unite their families and their fortunes. And she agrees to do this. And then they explain that the action in chapter 95 had actually happened prior to that visit, which we read about on Friday, where Madame Danglars and her daughter Eugenie went to the home of the Villeforts, where we saw Valentine Villefort pass out after basically being poisoned by persons unknown. So then, the next chapter that we read yesterday was chapter 96, the contract. In the contract, 3 days had passed since that scene between Eugenie and her father, in which she had agreed to marry Andrea Cavalcanti basically for money. And so they're at the party where they're going to have the signing, where I guess it's sort of a thing where they sign the contracts, and that's sort of like the start of the civil ceremony basically. And it actually, at the start of the chapter, Andrea goes to visit the Count of Monte Cristo first, and he wants to talk with him and ask him if he will, like, you know, assist with this. And the Count of Monte Cristo is sort of like, well, you know, I didn't actually do anything to push this union. I'm happy to be there, I'm happy to support it, but I'm not the cause of it, because Andrea keeps trying to say, like, well, you have helped accomplish this thing, and he's like, no, I didn't. And so we see the Count of Monte Cristo distancing himself from Andrea Cavalcanti and reminding Andrea, as he has reminded several people in the past, that he is not the sponsor of Andrea Cavalcanti. We find later on in this chapter why that's going to happen, and it's because during the actual party in which Andrea and Eugenie will be signing the documents, which will officially, I don't think it actually marries them, but it's sort of like the contract saying that they will indeed wed. Sort of like signing a prenup is what it sounds like a little bit, but the two of them are getting ready to sign their documents. The parents are signing. Madame Danglars, in fact, is just signed when they turn, and there's an interruption at the party. And that interruption is that some officials come in saying that they are looking for somebody going by the name of Andrea Cavalcanti. And when they say, well, why are you looking for this Andrea? It's like, well, because he was a galley slave who had, he goes by the name of Andrea Cavalcanti, but he is actually a galley slave who had escaped from confinement at Toulon. He had been chained up to a man named Caderousse, who he then murdered in the home of the Count of Monte Cristo. So the chapter ends with Monte Cristo looking around and Andrea having left the ballroom. And so now we'll find out what happens in the next scenes, chapters 97 and 98 of The Count of Monte Cristo. Chapter 97, The Departure for Belgium. A few minutes after the scene of confusion produced in the salons of Monsieur Danglars by the unexpected appearance of the brigade of soldiers, and by the disclosure which had followed, the mansion was deserted with as much rapidity as if a case of plague or of cholera morbus had broken out among the guests. In a few minutes, through all the doors, down all the staircases, by every exit, everyone hastened to retire, or rather to fly, for it was a situation where the ordinary condolences, which even the best friends are so eager to offer in great catastrophes, were seen to be utterly futile. There remained in the banker's house only Danglars, closeted in his study and making his statement to the officer of gendarmes, Madame Danglars, terrified, in the boudoir with which we are acquainted, and Eugenie, who with haughty air and disdainful lip had retired to her room with her inseparable companion, Mademoiselle Louise d'Armilly. As for the numerous servants, more numerous that evening than usual, for their number was augmented by cooks and butlers from the Café de Paris, venting on their employers their anger at what they termed the insult to which they had been subjected, they collected in groups in the hall, in the kitchens, or in their rooms, thinking very little of their duty, which was thus naturally interrupted. Of all this household, only two persons deserve our notice. These are Mademoiselle Eugenie Danglars and Mademoiselle Louise d'Armilly. The betrothed had retired, as we said, with haughty air, disdainful lip, and the demeanor of an outraged queen, followed by her companion, who was paler and more disturbed than herself. On reaching her room, Eugenie locked her door, while Louise fell on a chair. "Oh, what a dreadful thing!" said the young musician. "Who would have suspected it? Monsieur Andrea Cavalcanti, a murderer, a galley slave escaped, a convict!" An ironical smile curled the lip of Eugenie. "In truth, I was fated," said she. "I escaped the Morcerf, only to fall into the Cavalcanti." "Oh, do not confound the two, Eugenie." "Hold your tongue. The men are all infamous, and I am happy to be able now to do more than detest them. I despise them." "What shall we do?" asked Louise. "What shall we do?" "Yes. Why, the same we had intended doing 3 days since. Set off." "What? Although you are not now going to be married, you intend still—" "Listen, Louise. I hate this life of the fashionable world, always ordered, measured, ruled, like our music paper. What I have always wished for, desired, and coveted is the life of an artist, free and independent, relying only on my own resources and accountable only to myself. Remain here? What for? That they may try a month hence to marry me again? And to whom? Monsieur Debray, perhaps, as it was once proposed? No, Louise, no. This evening's adventure will serve for my excuse. I did not seek one, I did not ask for one. God sends me this, and I hail it joyfully." "How strong and courageous you are," said the fair, frail girl to her brunette companion. "Did you not yet know me?" Come, Louise, let us talk of our affairs. The post-chaise was happily bought 3 days since. Have you had it sent where we are to go for it? Yes. Our passport? Here it is. And Eugenie, with her usual precision, opened a printed paper and read, Monsieur Léon d'Armilly, 20 years of age, profession, artist, hair, black, eyes, black, traveling with his sister. Capital! How did you get this passport? When I went to ask Monsieur de Monte Cristo for letters to the directors of the theaters at Rome and Naples, I expressed my fears of traveling as a woman. He perfectly understood them and undertook to procure for me a man's passport, and 2 days after I received this, to which I have added with my own hand, traveling with his sister. Well, said Eugenie cheerfully, we have then only to pack up our trunks. We shall start the evening of the signing of the contract instead of the evening of the wedding. That is all. But consider the matter seriously, Eugenie. Oh, I am done with considering. I am tired of hearing only of market reports, of the end of the month, of the rise and fall of Spanish funds, of Haitian bonds. Instead of that, Louise, do you understand? Air, liberty, melody of birds, plains of Lombardy, Venetian canals, Roman palaces, the Bay of Naples. How much have we, Louise? The young girl to whom this question was addressed drew from an inlaid secretaire a small portfolio with a lock, in which she counted 23 banknotes. 23,000 francs, said she. And as much, at least, in pearls, diamonds, and jewels, said Eugenie. We are rich. With 45,000 francs, we can live like princesses for 2 years and comfortably for 4. But before 6 months, you with your music and I with my voice, we shall double our capital. Come, you shall take charge of the money, I of the jewel box, so that if one of us had the misfortune to lose her treasure, the other would still have hers left. Now, the portmanteau. Let us make haste. The portmanteau! Stop, said Louise, going to listen at Madame Danglars' door. What do you fear? That we may be discovered. The door is locked. They may tell us to open it. They may if they like, but we will not. You are a perfect Amazon, Eugenie. And the 2 young girls began to heap into a trunk all the things they thought they should require. There now, said Eugenie. While I change my costume, do you lock the portmanteau. Louise pressed with all the strength of her little hands on the top of the portmanteau. But I cannot, said she. I am not strong enough. Do you shut it. Ah, you will do well to ask, said Eugenie, laughing. I forgot that I was Hercules, and you only the pale Omphale. And the young girl, kneeling on the top, pressed the 2 parts of the portmanteau together, and Mademoiselle d'Armilly passed the bolt of the padlock through. When this was done, Eugenie opened a drawer, of which she kept the key, and took from it a wadded violet silk traveling cloak. Here, said she, you see I have thought of everything. With this cloak you will not be cold. But you? Oh, I am never cold, you know. Besides, with these men's clothes. Will you dress here? Certainly. Shall you have time? Do not be uneasy, you little coward. All our servants are busy discussing the grand affair. Besides, what is there astonishing when you think of the grief I ought to be in that I shut myself up? Tell me. No, truly, you comfort me. Come and help me. From the same drawer she took a man's complete costume, from the boots to the coat, and a provision of linen, where there was nothing superfluous, but every requisite. Then, with a promptitude which indicated that this was not the first time she had amused herself by adopting the garb of the opposite sex, Eugenie drew on the boots and pantaloons, tied her cravat, buttoned her waistcoat up to the throat, and put on a coat which admirably fitted her beautiful figure. Oh, that is very good. Indeed, it is very good, said Louise, looking at her with admiration. But that beautiful black hair, those magnificent braids which made all the ladies sigh with envy, will they go under a man's hat like the one I see down there? You shall see, said Eugenie, and with her left hand seizing the thick mass, which her long fingers could scarcely grasp, she took in her right hand a pair of long scissors, and soon the steel met through the rich and splendid hair, which fell in a cluster at her feet as she leaned back to keep it from her coat. Then she grasped the front hair, which she also cut out without expressing the least regret. On the contrary, her eyes sparkled with greater pleasure than usual under her ebony eyebrows. "Oh, the magnificent hair!" said Louise with regret. "And am I not 100 times better thus?" cried Eugenie, smoothing the scattered curls of her hair, which had now quite a masculine appearance. "And do you not think me handsomer so?" "Oh, you are beautiful, always beautiful," cried Louise. "Now, where are you going?" "To Brussels, if you like. It is the nearest frontier. We can go to Brussels, Liège, Aix-la-Chapelle, then up to the Rhine to Strasbourg. We will cross Switzerland and go down into Italy by the St. Gothard. Will that do?" "Yes." "What are you looking at?" "I am looking at you. Indeed, you are adorable like that. One would say you were carrying me off." "And they would be right, pardieu." "Oh, I think you swore, Eugenie." And the two young girls, whom everyone might have thought plunged in grief, the one on her own account, the other from interest in her friend, burst out laughing as they cleared away every visible trace of the disorder which had naturally accompanied the preparations for their escape. Then, having blown out the lights, the two fugitives, looking and listening eagerly, with outstretched necks, opened the door of a dressing-room which led to a side staircase down to the yard, Eugenie going first and holding with one arm the portmanteau, which by the opposite handle Mademoiselle d'Armilly scarcely raised with both hands. The yard was empty. The clock was striking 12. The porter was not yet gone to bed. Eugenie approached softly and saw the old man sleeping soundly in an armchair in his lodge. She returned to Louise, took up the portmanteau, which she had placed for a moment on the ground, and they reached the archway under the shadow of the wall. Eugenie concealed Louise in an angle of the gateway, so that if the porter chanced to awake he might see but one person. Then placing herself in the full light of the lamp which lit the yard, "Gate!" cried she, with her finest contralto voice, and rapping at the window. The porter got up as Eugenie expected, and even advanced some steps to recognize the person who was going out. But seeing a young man striking his boot impatiently with his riding whip, he opened it immediately. Louise slid through the half-open gate like a snake and bounded lightly forward. Eugenie, apparently calm, although in all probability her heart beat somewhat faster than usual, went out in her turn. A porter was passing, and they gave him the portmanteau. Then the two young girls, having told him to take it to number 36, Rue de la Victoire, walked behind this man, whose presence comforted Louise. As for Eugenie, she was as strong as a Judith or a Delilah. They arrived at the appointed spot. Eugenie ordered the porter to put down the portmanteau, gave him some pieces of money, and having rapped at the shutter, sent him away. The shutter where Eugenie had rapped was that of a little laundress, who had been previously warned and was not yet gone to bed. She opened the door. "Mademoiselle," said Eugenie, "let the porter get the post-chaise from the coach-house and fetch some post-horses from the hotel. Here are 5 francs for his trouble." "Indeed," said Louise, "I admire you, and I could almost say respect you." The laundress looked on in astonishment, but as she had been promised 20 louis, she made no remark. In a quarter of an hour the porter returned with the post-boy and horses, which were harnessed, and put in the post-chaise in a minute, while the porter fastened the portmanteau on with the assistance of a cord and strap. "Here is the passport," said the postilion. "Which way are we going, young gentleman?" "To Fontainebleau," replied Eugenie, with an almost masculine voice. "What do you say?" said Louise. "I am giving them the slip," said Eugenie. "This woman to whom we have given 20 louis may betray us for 40. We will soon alter our direction." And the young girl jumped into the britska, which was admirably arranged for sleeping in, without scarcely touching the step. "You are always right," said the music teacher, seating herself by the side of her friend. A quarter of an hour afterwards the postilion, having been put in the right road, passed with the crack of his whip through the gateway of the Barrière Saint-Martin. "Ah," said Louise, breathing freely, "here we are, out of Paris." "Yes, my dear, the abduction is an accomplished fact," replied Eugenie. "Yes, and without violence," said Louise. "I shall bring that forward as an extenuating circumstance," replied Eugenie. These words were lost in the noise which the carriage made in rolling over the pavement of La Villette. Monsieur Danglars no longer had a daughter. And now chapter 98, The Bell and Bottle Tavern. And now let us leave Mademoiselle Danglars and her friend pursuing their way to Brussels, and return to poor Andrea Cavalcanti, so inopportunely interrupted in his rise to fortune. Notwithstanding his youth, Master Andrea was a very skilful and intelligent boy. We have seen that on the first rumor which reached the salon he had gradually approached the door, and crossing 2 or 3 rooms at last disappeared. But we have forgotten to mention one circumstance which nevertheless ought not to be omitted. In one of the rooms he crossed, the trousseau of the bride-elect was on exhibition. There were caskets of diamonds, cashmere shawls, Valenciennes lace, English veils, and in fact all the tempting things, the bare mention of which makes the heart of young girls bound with joy, and which is called the corbeille. Now in passing through this room, Andrea proved himself not only to be clever and intelligent, but also provident, for he helped himself to the most valuable of the ornaments before him. Furnished with this plunder, Andrea leapt with a lighter heart from the window, intending to slip through the hands of the gendarme. Tall and well-proportioned as an ancient gladiator, and muscular as a Spartan, he walked for a quarter of an hour without knowing where to direct his steps, actuated by the sole idea of getting away from the spot, where if he lingered, he knew that he would surely be taken. Having passed through the Rue de Mont Blanc, guided by the instinct which leads thieves always to take the safest path, he found himself at the end of the Rue Lafayette. There he stopped, breathless and panting. He was quite alone. On one side was the vast wilderness of the Saint-Lazare, on the other, Paris enshrouded in darkness. "Am I to be captured?" he cried. "No, not if I can use more activity than my enemies. My safety is now a mere question of speed." At this moment he saw a cab at the top of the Faubourg Poissonnière. The dull driver, smoking his pipe, was plodding along towards the limits of the Faubourg Saint-Denis, where no doubt he ordinarily had his station. "Ho, friend," said Benedetto. "What do you want, sir?" asked the driver. "Is your horse tired?" "Tired? Oh, yes, tired enough. He has done nothing the whole of this blessed day. 4 wretched fares and 20 sous over, making in all 7 francs, are all that I have earned, and I ought to take 10 to the owner." "Will you add these 20 francs to the 7 you have?" "With pleasure, sir. 20 francs are not to be despised. Tell me, what am I to do for this?" "A very easy thing if your horse isn't tired. I tell you he'll go like the wind. Only tell me which way to drive." "Toward the Louvres." I know the way. You get good sweetened rum over there." "Exactly so. I merely wish to overtake one of my friends with whom I am going to hunt tomorrow at Chapelle and Serval. He should have waited for me here with the cabriolet till 11:30. It is 12, and tired of waiting, he must have gone on." "It is likely." "Well, will you try and overtake him?" "Nothing I should like better." "If you do not overtake him before we reach Bourget, you shall have 20 francs. If not before Louvres, 30. And if we do overtake him?" 40, said Andrea, after a moment's hesitation, at the end of which he remembered that he might safely promise. "That's all right," said the man. "Hop in, and we're off. Whoop-la!" Andrea got into the cab, which passed rapidly through the Faubourg Saint-Denis, along the Faubourg Saint-Martin, crossed the barrier, and threaded its way through the interminable Villette. They never overtook the chimerical friend, yet Andrea frequently inquired of people on foot whom he passed, and at the inns which were not yet closed, for a green cabriolet and bay horse. And as there are a great many cabriolets to be seen on the road to the Low Countries, and as 9/10 of them are green, the inquiries increased at every step. Everyone had just seen it pass. It was only 500, 200, 100 steps in advance. At length they reached it, but it was not the friend. Once the cab was also passed by a calash rapidly whirled along by 2 post-horses. "Ah," said Cavalcanti to himself, "if I only had that briska, those 2 good post-horses, and above all the passport that carries them on." And he sighed deeply. The calash contained Mademoiselle Danglars and Mademoiselle d'Armilly. "Hurry, hurry," said Andrea. "We must overtake him soon." And the poor horse resumed the desperate gallop it had kept up since leaving the barrier, and arrived steaming at Louvres. "Certainly," said Andrea, "I shall not overtake my friend, but I shall kill your horse. Therefore I had better stop. Here are 30 francs. I will sleep at the Cheval Rouge and will secure a place in the first coach. Good night, friend." And Andrea, after placing 6 pieces of 5 francs each in the man's hand, leapt lightly onto the pathway. The cabman joyfully pocketed the sum and turned back on his road to Paris. Andrea pretended to go towards the hotel of the Cheval Rouge, but after leaning an instant against the door and hearing the last sound of the cab, which was disappearing from view, he went on his road, and with a lusty stride soon traversed the space of 2 leagues. Then he rested. He must be near Chapelle and Serval, where he pretended to be going. It was not fatigue that stayed Andrea here. It was that he might form some resolution, adopt some plan. It would be impossible to make use of a diligence, equally so to engage post-horses. To travel either way, a passport was necessary. It was still more impossible to remain in the department of the Oise, one of the most open and strictly guarded in France. This was quite out of the question, especially to a man like Andrea, perfectly conversant with criminal matters. He sat down by the side of the moat, buried his face in his hands, and reflected. 10 minutes after, he raised his head. His resolution was made. He threw some dust over the topcoat, which he found time to unhook from the antechamber and button over his ball costume, and going to Chapelle and Serval, he knocked loudly at the door of the only inn in the place. The host opened. "My friend," said Andrea, "I was coming from Mortefontaine to Senlis, when my horse, which is a troublesome creature, stumbled and threw me. I must reach Compiègne tonight, or I shall cause deep anxiety to my family. Could you let me hire a horse of you?" An innkeeper has always a horse to let, whether it be good or bad. The host called the stable boy and ordered him to saddle Leblanc. Then he awoke his son, a child of 7 years, whom he ordered to ride before the gentleman and bring back the horse. Andrea gave the innkeeper 20 francs, and in taking them from his pocket, dropped a visiting card. This belonged to one of his friends at the Café de Paris, so that the innkeeper, picking it up after Andrea had left, was convinced that he had let his horse to the Count of Malion, number 25 Rue Saint-Dominique, that being the name and address on the card. Leblanc was not a fast animal, but he kept up an easy, steady pace. In 3 hours and a half, Andrea had traversed the 9 leagues which separated him from Compiègne, and 4 o'clock struck as he reached the place where the coaches stop. There is an excellent tavern at Compiègne, well remembered by those who have ever been there. Andrea, who had often stayed there in his rides about Paris, recollected the Bell and Bottle Inn. He turned around, saw the sign by the light of a reflected lamp, and having dismissed the child, giving him all the small coin he had about him, he began knocking at the door, very reasonably concluding that having now 3 or 4 hours before him, he had best fortify himself against the fatigues of the morrow by a sound sleep and a good supper. A waiter opened the door. "My friend," said Andrea, "I have been dining at Saint-Jean-au-Bois, and expected to catch the coach which passes by at midnight. But like a fool I have lost my way, and have been walking for the last 4 hours in the forest. Show me into one of those pretty little rooms which overlook the court, and bring me a cold fowl and a bottle of Bordeaux." The waiter had no suspicions. Andrea spoke with perfect composure. He had a cigar in his mouth and his hands in the pocket of his topcoat. His clothes were fashionably made, his smooth chin, his boots irreproachable. He looked merely as if he had stayed out very late. That was all. While the waiter was preparing his room, the hostess arose. Andrea assumed his most charming smile, and asked if he could have number 3, which he had occupied on his last stay at Compiègne. Unfortunately, number 3 was engaged by a young man who was traveling with his sister. Andrea appeared in despair, but consoled himself when the hostess assured him that number 7, prepared for him, was situated precisely the same as number 3, and while warming his feet and chatting about the last races at Chantilly, he waited until they announced his room to be ready. Andrea had not spoken without cause of the pretty rooms looking out upon the court of the Belle Hotel, which, with its triple galleries like those of a theatre, with the jessamine and clematis twining round the light columns, forms one of the prettiest entrances to an inn that you can imagine. The fowl was tender, the wine old, the fire clear and sparkling, and Andrea was surprised to find himself eating with as good an appetite as though nothing had happened. Then he went to bed, and almost immediately fell into that deep sleep which is sure to visit men of 20 years of age, even when they are torn with remorse. Now, here we are obliged to own that Andrea ought to have felt remorse, but that he did not. This was the plan which had appealed to him to afford the best chance of his security. Before daybreak, he would awake, leave the inn after rigorously paying his bill, and reaching the forest he would, under pretense of making studies in painting, test the hospitality of some peasants, procure himself the dress of a woodcutter and a hatchet, casting off the lion's skin to assume that of the woodman. Then, with his hands covered with dirt, his hair darkened by means of a leaden comb, his complexion embrowned with the preparation for which one of his old comrades had given him the recipe, he intended, by following the wooded districts, to reach the nearest frontier, walking by night and sleeping in the day in the forests and quarries, and only entering inhabited regions to buy a loaf from time to time. Once past the frontier, Andrea proposed making money of his diamonds, and by uniting the proceeds to 10 banknotes he always carried about him in case of accident, he would then find himself possessor of about 50,000 livres, which he philosophically considered as no very deplorable condition after all. Moreover, he reckoned much on the interest of the Danglars to hush up the rumor of their own misadventures. These were the reasons which, added to the fatigue, caused Andrea to sleep so soundly. In order that he might wake early, he did not close the shutters, but contented himself with bolting the door and placing on the table an unclasped and long-pointed knife, whose temper he well knew, and which was never absent from him. About 7 in the morning, Andrea was awakened by a ray of sunlight, which played, warm and brilliant, upon his face. In all well-organized brains, the predominating idea, and there always is one, is sure to be the last thought before sleeping and the first upon waking in the morning. Andrea had scarcely opened his eyes when his predominating idea presented itself and whispered in his ear that he had slept too long. He jumped out of bed and ran to the window. A gendarme was crossing the court. A gendarme is one of the most striking objects in the world, even to a man void of uneasiness. But for one who has a timid conscience, and with good cause too, the yellow, blue, and white uniform is really very alarming. "Why is that gendarme here?" asked Andrea of himself. Then all at once he replied, with that logic which the reader has, doubtless, remarked in him, "There is nothing astonishing in seeing a gendarme at an inn. Instead of being astonished, let me dress myself." And the youth dressed himself with the facility his valet de chambre had failed to rob him of during the 2 months of fashionable life he had led in Paris. "Now then," said Andrea, while dressing himself, "I'll wait till he leaves, and then I'll slip away." And saying this, Andrea, who had now put on his boots and cravat, stole gently to the window, and a second time lifted up the muslin curtain. Not only was the first gendarme still there, but the young man now perceived a second yellow, blue, and white uniform at the foot of the staircase, the only one by which he could descend, while a third, on horseback, holding a musket in his fist, was posted as a sentinel at the great street door, which alone afforded the means of egress. The appearance of the third gendarme settled the matter, for a crowd of curious loungers was extended before him, effectually blocking the entrance to the hotel. "They're after me," was Andrea's first thought. Diable! A pallor overspread the young man's forehead, and he looked around him with anxiety. His room, like all those on the same floor, had but one outlet to the gallery, in the sight of everybody. "I am lost," was his second thought. And indeed, for a man in Andrea's situation, an arrest means the assizes, trial, and death without mercy or delay. For a moment he convulsively pressed his head within his hands, and during that brief period he became nearly mad with terror. But soon a ray of hope glimmered in the multitude of thoughts which bewildered his mind, and a faint smile played upon his white lips and pallid cheeks. He looked around and saw the objects of his search upon the chimney-piece. They were a pen, ink, and paper. With forced composure, he dipped the pen in the ink and wrote the following lines upon a sheet of paper. "I have no money to pay my bill, but I am not a dishonest man. I leave behind me as a pledge this pin, worth 10 times the amount. I shall be excused for leaving it at daybreak, for I was ashamed." He then drew the pin from his cravat and placed it on the paper. This done, instead of leaving the door fastened, He drew back the bolts and even placed the door ajar, as though he had left the room, forgetting to close it, and slipping into the chimney like a man accustomed to that kind of gymnastic exercise, after replacing the chimney board, which represented Achilles with De Maria, and effacing the very marks of his feet upon the ashes, he commenced climbing the hollow tunnel, which afforded him the only means of escape left. At this precise time, the first gendarme Andrea had noticed walked upstairs, preceded by the commissary of police, and supported by the second gendarme, who guarded the staircase and was himself reinforced by the one stationed at the door. Andrea was indebted for this visit to the following circumstances. At daybreak, the telegraphs were set at work in all directions, and almost immediately the authorities in every district had exerted their utmost endeavors to arrest the murderer of Caderousse. Compiègne, that royal residence and fortified town, is well furnished with authorities, gendarmes, and commissaries of police. They therefore began operations as soon as the telegraphic dispatch arrived, and the Bell and Bottle being the best-known hotel in the town, they had naturally directed their first inquiries there. Now, besides the reports of the sentinels guarding the Hôtel de Ville, which is next door to the Bell and Bottle, it had been stated by others that a number of travelers had arrived during the night. The sentinel who was relieved at 6 o'clock in the morning remembered perfectly that, just as he was taking his post a few minutes past 4, a young man arrived on horseback, with a little boy before him. The young man, having dismissed the boy and horse, knocked at the door of the hotel, which was opened and again closed after his entrance. This late arrival had attracted much suspicion, and the young man being no other than Andrea, the commissary and gendarme, who was a brigadier, directed their steps towards his room. They found the door ajar. "Oh," said the brigadier, who thoroughly understood the trick. "A bad sign to find the door open. I would rather find it triply bolted." And indeed, the little note and pin upon the table confirmed, or rather corroborated, the sad truth. Andrea had fled. We say corroborated because the brigadier was too experienced to be convinced by a single proof. He glanced around, looked in the bed, shook the curtains, opened the closets, and finally stopped at the chimney. Andrea had taken the precaution to leave no traces of his feet in the ashes, but still it was an outlet, and in this light was not to be passed over without serious investigation. The brigadier sent for some sticks and straw, and having filled the chimney with them, set a light to it. The fire crackled, and the smoke ascended like a dull vapor from a volcano, but still no prisoner fell down, as they expected. The fact was that Andrea, at war with society ever since his youth, was quite as deep as a gendarme, even though he were advanced to the rank of brigadier, and quite prepared for the fire. He had climbed out on the roof and was crouching down among the chimney pots. At one time he thought he was saved, for he heard the brigadier exclaim in a loud voice to the two gendarmes, "He is not here." But venturing to peep, he perceived that the latter, instead of retiring, as might have been reasonably expected upon this announcement, were watching with increased attention. It was now his turn to look about him. The Hôtel de Ville, a massive 16th century building, was on his right. Anyone could descend from the openings in the tower and examine every corner of the roof below, and Andrea expected momentarily to see the head of a gendarme appear at one of these openings. If once discovered, he knew he would be lost, for the roof afforded no chance of escape. He therefore resolved to descend, not through the same chimney by which he had come up, but by a similar one conducting to another room. He looked around for a chimney from which no smoke issued, and having reached it, he disappeared through the orifice without being seen by anyone. At the same minute, one of the little windows of the Hôtel de Ville was thrown open, and the head of a gendarme appeared. For an instant it remained motionless as one of the stone decorations of the building. Then after a long sigh of disappointment the head disappeared. The brigadier, calm and dignified as the law he represented, passed through the crowd, without answering the 1,000 questions addressed to him, and re-entered the hotel. "Well?" asked the two gendarmes. "Well, my boys," said the brigadier, "the brigand must really have escaped early this morning. But we will send to the Villers-Cotterets and Noyon roads and search the forest, when we shall catch him, no doubt." The honorable functionary had scarcely expressed himself thus, in that intonation which is peculiar to brigadiers of the gendarmerie, when a loud scream, accompanied by the violent ringing of a bell, resounded through the court of the hotel. "Ah, what is that?" cried the brigadier. "Some traveler seems impatient," said the host. What number was it that rang? Number 3. Run, waiter! At this moment, the screams and ringing were redoubled. Aha, said the brigadier, stopping the servant. The person who is ringing appears to want something more than waiter. We will attend upon him with a gendarme. Who occupies number 3? The little fellow who arrived last night in a post-chaise with his sister, and who asked for an apartment with 2 beds. The bell here rang for the 3rd time, with another shriek of anguish. Follow me, Mr. Commissary, said the brigadier. Tread in my steps. Wait an instant, said the host. Number 3 has 2 staircases, inside and outside. Good, said the brigadier. I will take charge of the inside one. Are the carbines loaded? Yes, brigadier. Well, you guard the exterior, and if he attempts to fly, fire upon him. He must be a great criminal, from what the telegraph says. The brigadier, followed by the commissary, disappeared by the inside staircase, accompanied by the noise which his assertions respecting Andrea had excited in the crowd. This is what had happened. Andrea had very cleverly managed to descend 2/3 of the chimney, but then his foot slipped, and notwithstanding his endeavors, he came into the room with more speed and noise than he intended. It would have signified little had the room been empty, but unfortunately it was occupied. 2 ladies, sleeping in one bed, were awakened by the noise, and fixing their eyes upon the spot whence the sound proceeded, they saw a man. One of these ladies, the fair one, uttered those terrible shrieks which resounded through the house, while the other, rushing to the bell rope, rang with all her strength. Andrea, as we can see, was surrounded by misfortune. For pity's sake, he cried, pale and bewildered, without seeing whom he was dressing. For pity's sake, do not call assistance. Save me. I will not harm you. Andrea, the murderer, cried one of the ladies. Eugenie? Mademoiselle Danglars? Exclaimed Andrea, stupefied. Help! Help! Cried Mademoiselle d'Armilly, taking the bell from her companion's hand and ringing it yet more violently. Save me! I am pursued, said Andrea, clasping his hands. For pity, for mercy's sake, do not deliver me up. It is too late. They are coming, said Eugenie. Well, conceal me somewhere. You can say you were needlessly alarmed. You can turn their suspicions and save my life. The 2 ladies, pressing closely to one another and drawing the bedclothes tightly around them, remained silent to the supplicating voice, repugnance and fear taking possession of their minds. Well, be it so, at length, said Eugenie. Return by the same road you came, and we will say nothing about you, unhappy wretch. Here he is, cried a voice from the landing. Here he is, I see him. The brigadier had put his eye to the keyhole, and had discovered Andrea in a posture of entreaty. A violent blow from the butt end of the musket broke open the lock. 2 more forced out the bolts, and the broken door fell in. Andrea ran to the other door, leading to the gallery, ready to rush out. But he was stopped short, and he stood with his body a little thrown back, pale, and with the useless knife in his clenched hand. Fly, then, cried Mademoiselle d'Armilly, whose pity returned as her fears diminished. Fly! Or kill yourself, said Eugenie, in a tone which a vestal in the amphitheater would have used when urging the victorious gladiator to finish his vanquished adversary. Andrea shuddered and looked on the young girl with an expression which proved how little he understood such ferocious honor. Kill myself, he cried, throwing down his knife. Why should I do so? Why, you said, answered Mademoiselle Danglars, that you would be condemned to die like the worst criminals. Bah, said Cavalcanti, crossing his arms. One has friends. The brigadier advanced to him, sword in hand. Come, come, said Andrea. Sheathe your sword, my fine fellow. There is no occasion to make such a fuss, since I give myself up. And he held out his hands to be manacled. The 2 girls looked with horror upon this shameful metamorphosis, the man of the world shaking off his covering and appearing as a galley slave. Andrea turned towards them and with an impertinent smile asked, Have you any message for your father, Mademoiselle Danglars? For in all probability I shall return to Paris. Eugenie covered her face with her hands. Oh-ho, said Andrea. You need not be ashamed, even though you did post after me. Was I not nearly your husband? And with this raillery, Andrea went out, leaving the 2 girls a prey to their own feelings of shame and to the comments of the crowd. An hour after they stepped into their calash, both dressed in feminine attire. The gate of the hotel had been closed to screen them from sight, but they were forced, when the door was opened, to pass through a throng of curious glances and whispering voices. Eugenie closed her eyes, but though she could not see, she could hear, and the sneers of the crowd reached her in the carriage. "Oh, why is not the world a wilderness?" she exclaimed, throwing herself into the arms of Mademoiselle d'Armilly, her eyes sparkling with the same kind of rage which made Nero wish that the Roman world had but one neck, that he might sever it at a single blow. The next day they stopped at the Hotel de Flandre at Brussels. The same evening, Andrea was incarcerated in the conciergerie. And that concludes chapters 97 and 98. I can't say my numbers today. Where we learn more about what happened with Andrea and Mademoiselle Danglars. So the former betrothed have each managed to meet each other again and yet gone their separate ways. So thank you very much for joining me today. I will see you tomorrow. And remember, keep voting on what you want to read next. As they used to say in the bad old days, vote early, vote often. See ya.